Alright, this week we are talking about the heart and blood vessels. So the heart is covered in chapter 17, blood vessels are going to be chapter 18. So we are going to briefly look at different structural components of the heart. We'll also cover this in lab, but there are some things that we want to touch on here in lecture. We'll trace the pathway of blood flow through the heart, look briefly at the size and shape and location of the heart, the differences in atrial and ventricular contractions, how the heart actually beats the cardiac conducting system. We'll briefly talk about electrocardiograms, also known as ECGs or EKGs, and then we'll wrap up the heart chapter talking about fetal heart development pretty briefly. So section 2 of chapter 17 is focused mostly on the kind of location and structural components of the heart. So our heart is located in the thoracic cavity, within the pericardial cavity. There is a pericardial sac that surrounds the heart. That's a big protective membrane around it. And in between the two layers of the membrane is serous fluid for some extra cushioning. Heart is not going to be dead center of the body in between the lungs. It is usually going to sit slightly off to the left-hand side of the chest, and the lungs are actually structured a little bit differently from each other because of this. And we'll talk about that when we get to the respiratory system later in the semester. So the heart is located within a region called the mediastinum, which is indicated here with these dashed lines. And so the mediastinum is going to contain not just the heart, but also some of the major vessels coming out of the heart, and the trachea and esophagus that are going to be located posterior to the heart. This pericardial cavity, we've got that kind of briefly outlined right here. That's going to be two layers of connective tissue. So we're going to have the parietal layer and the visceral layer. The parietal layer is going to form kind of this outer part of the sac, and then the visceral layer is going to sit right on the surface of the heart itself. I'm going to be posting a video from the Institute for Human Anatomy. It's a little YouTube short that actually shows how this is structured and how the two layers are actually fused together, kind of up here in the upper portion of the heart. And so it just kind of transitions one into the other. So that pericardial cavity, again, is protective, and it also offers some cushioning because there is going to be some serous fluid in between those two layers of the pericardial cavity. Helps reduce friction and stuff like that. So the heart is roughly pine cone shaped, so we've got a wider upper portion, and then it tapers off closer to a point at the apex of the heart down here. And obviously it's not exactly shaped like a pine cone, but that's the rough shape of it, and then we've got a lot of vessels coming out of that upper region of the heart. The heart's going to be roughly about the size of your fist. Some people are going to have a slightly larger heart than that. Some people are going to have a slightly smaller heart than that, just due to genetics, as well as hormones. So the sex hormones that are coming from the ovaries and or testes are going to determine partially the size of the heart. So people who are producing a lot of testosterone tend to have slightly larger hearts than people who are not producing a lot of testosterone. But it's not a significant difference. Generally, people who are producing a lot of testosterone, the heart's going to weigh about 11 to 12 ounces, whereas somebody who's not producing those high levels of testosterone is going to have a heart weighing about 9 to 11 ounces. So slight difference, a little bit of overlap there. And then athletes, really dedicated athletes, especially those specializing in aerobic sports like marathon runners and stuff like that, usually you're going to have larger hearts because just like skeletal muscle, if you are working the heart muscle out, it is going to grow in size a little bit. Those cells are going to get a little bit bigger and increase in number. So the heart has two systems of blood circulation that travel through the different chambers of the heart. So the heart has two atria, they are the smaller chambers up here towards the top of the heart, closest to all of the vessels, and then 2 ventricles down here towards the bottom, closer to that apex of the heart. And then the right and left sides of the heart are each going to have their own kind of circulation system. They are tied together, but the blood has to travel through other parts of the body first. And as you can see in this diagram up here, we've got different colors for the different sides of the heart. All of the structures from the right side of the heart are largely in blue, and everything from the left side of the heart is largely in red. Generally speaking, in cardiology, we are going to use the color red to represent oxygenated blood, and the color blue to represent deoxygenated blood. So most of the blood that is here in this right hand side of the heart is deoxygenated blood coming back from the body, where it's already dropped off its oxygen. It's bringing carbon dioxide back, and so it's going to come through here and actually get sent out to the lungs after that, before coming back into the left hand side of the heart once it's picked up some more oxygen and is getting ready to get pumped out to the body to go ahead and deliver that fresh oxygen out to the cells. So the atria are kind of the initial collecting chambers of the heart. So the right atria over here is where the superior and inferior vena cava are coming in. Those are the main veins of the body that are bringing blood and kind of collecting it from the different parts of the body and bringing it back into the heart. So this is deoxygenated blood that is going to get collected in that right atrium. It's going to get pumped through one of the many valves in the heart into the right ventricle. And so the ventricles are where most of the muscle of the heart is located. So in this diagram, you can kind of see the atria up here have a very, very thin layer around them, whereas the ventricles have a much, much thicker layer of muscle around them. And that's because those ventricles are doing that pumping action. It's not really the atria that are doing that pumping action. So we'll come into that right ventricle of the heart, and then blood gets pumped from there out of the pulmonary trunk through the pulmonary arteries and out to the lungs, and that is called the pulmonary circuit. And so this is pulling deoxygenated blood from the body, collecting it in the heart, sending it to the lungs for that gas exchange to happen, and then it's going to come back into the heart with that fresh oxygen and come through the left atria, collect it from the left atria, and then get pumped into the left ventricle, and the left ventricle is going to pump the blood out of the aorta, out to the rest of the body, into the systemic circulatory system. So we've got these two different circulatory systems, the pulmonary circuit and the systemic circuit. So the pulmonary circuit is blood being sent from the heart to the lungs and then back, and then the systemic circuit is blood being pumped from the heart out to the rest of the body that is not the lungs. And this includes the heart itself. The heart does have its own vessels going to it to help feed all of those muscle cells. So the heart is composed of some different layers of that heart wall. And so we already know that there's going to be a muscular layer, but there's some additional layers outside of that and inside of that. So we are looking at a cross-section here from the left ventricle. The left ventricle is usually going to have a slightly thicker muscular wall than the right ventricle, because the right ventricle doesn't have to pump blood as hard to get it to the lungs, which are located really close to the heart, whereas the left ventricle really has to pump hard to force that blood out of the aorta and out through the rest of the body, so it needs a lot more force. But the very most inner layer of the heart, so we can see this little layer right here, that's the endocardium, and then outside of that is the myocardium. Again, myo refers to muscle, cardium is all going to refer to something with the heart, so this is heart muscle right here. Again, very thick layers in the ventricles. And then we have the epicardium, and another name for the epicardia is the visceral layer of the pericardium. Or visceral layer of the serous pericardium. So I've mentioned this a little bit ago, but this is going to actually kind of connect in with this outer layer in the upper regions of the heart. I'll post that video that you can go ahead and look at. But this is same layer, just has a couple different possible names that it could be called that are interchangeable with each other. Then we have that parietal layer of the serous pericardium, and in between those two layers again is that pericardial cavity filled with serous fluid. And then on the very outermost layer of that connective tissue is the fibrous pericardium, to make sure that we have a very, very tough, durable sac that is containing the heart. And so there is a condition called pericarditis, which is inflammation of this pericardial cavity, usually due to a bacterial infection, but can be caused by other things. And so that is going to be a lot of inflammation here within these layers of connective tissue and in this actual serous fluid itself. So this is a lot of stuff that we are going to cover primarily in lab, but I do briefly want to point out the difference in anterior and posterior views of the heart, because they're going to look a bit different, and it's really important to know what you're looking at when you see pictures of heart. So up here at the top with this anterior view, this is a mirror image. So when you're looking at this, this is as if you were looking in a mirror, which means that everything over here on your left is actually the right side of the heart, and everything over here on your right hand side as you're looking at it is the left hand side of the heart, because you would have to basically flip this around to hold it up to your body in the correct position. All right, so that's really, really important to know, because a lot of these structures, as you can see, have that right and left in front of them, and that information is going to be required as part of your lab answers for a lot of these things. It's really important to specify right and left sides of the heart, because again, those different sides are doing slightly different things. Yes, they're still pumping blood, but where they're pumping the blood to and what type of blood is coming into them and leaving them is going to be very, very different. Down here we have that posterior view. So this is not a mirror image. You can imagine basically you would just pull this heart towards you, and that's how it would be oriented in your body. So then this is going to be accurate. Your left hand side matches the left hand side of the heart, and your right hand side matches the right hand side of the heart. All right. And so we can't see the actual chambers from this external view of the heart. There are auricles out here above the atria. Those are flaps of tissue. And so they are, auricle refers to an ear-like structure. So these kind of look roughly like the external ear of the human ear. And so these are pretty thin-walled structures. They can fill up with blood and actually empty into the atria. These can also sometimes be called atrial appendages. And so they are a useful part of helping keep that blood flow going through the heart. And then we've got all these major vessels coming out that we will cover in lab. So if we get a little bit more inside of the heart and kind of peel away some of those outer layers and look at the actual muscle fiber itself, this is kind of how those muscle fibers in the heart are going to be located. This is the myocardial layer. And so you can see the atrial muscles are kind of wrapping circular around those atria. And again, this is going to be very thin layers of muscles in the atria. They don't need to pump with a lot of force because they're just moving blood from the atria down into the ventricle, so not very far. So we don't need a lot of force to do that contraction, but they are going to kind of contract in a rhythmic fashion in a downwards motion, because we don't want to risk pumping blood back out of vessels. There are valves there to help prevent that from happening, but valves can fail in some cases. But we're going to squeeze in a circular motion to force that blood down into the ventricles. And then as you can see, once we're down in the ventricles, the structure of that myocardium layer changes and kind of becomes more of this figure 8 pattern. And that just has to do with how the heart develops. We'll look at that later in this chapter. So some of that has to do with how the heart develops. It basically starts out as kind of a long tube and then wraps and folds in on itself. It's really, really cool. So we'll talk about that later. And that is how our heart structure ends up being the way it is. But this ventricle over here is going to contract and force blood out up this way, and then this left ventricle over here is going to contract and force blood out that way. So the muscle fiber orientation does make a little bit of sense, but again, this is largely due to how the heart actually actually develops. And again, we're going to have much, much thicker muscle down here in the ventricle area. So this is kind of what that muscular layer is going to look like. So we can see those fibers going in different directions here, a little bit right there peeking out from underneath. And so in its relaxed state, those layers are going to look a little bit thinner, and in their contracted state, they're going to look quite a bit thicker. And as you can see, there's also going to be this layer of muscle in between the two ventricles. That is called the interventricular septum. We'll cover that in lab again too. And that's just dividing those two chambers of the heart. So we'll just kind of briefly look at these internal features of the heart. We'll cover a lot of these in lab later on. And so we do have some different valves in here. These are going to be made out of connective tissues. They are connected to special muscles in the heart by some tendons. We will see that again in lab a little bit later. And then we've got valves that are going to control blood flow to some of these major vessels. And the valve's main job is really just to prevent blood from flowing backwards. We want to keep blood moving in one specific direction through the heart. Otherwise, we do start to get some issues and stuff like that. A little bit of backwards blood flow is usually not going to cause significant issues, but it is ideal to have it all moving in one direction. So there are conditions where these valves can kind of prolapse and not close properly. One of the most common ones is in this valve right over here, the mitral or bicuspid valve, and so you may have heard of mitral valve prolapse before, and that's just when one of those valves is not closing properly. But we really want to keep that blood flow moving in one direction. There are some congenital heart defects. So a congenital heart defect is something that happens to the heart in utero that causes it to not fully develop properly. And so there are usually going to be potentially openings in the heart, or the vessels are not going to develop properly and stuff like that. And this can obviously cause some issues with the way the heart is functioning. And these congenital heart defects are usually not genetically based, and so this is generally not something that's going to be passed on from parent to child. That can happen, but usually this is just an unfortunate occurrence that happens during development of the heart. Some of these are less severe than others, but the severity can lead to a lot of surgery. So there is an opening up here, so a foramen ovale that fails to close. So this opening in between these two upper chambers of the heart that are not functioning quite as well as they should be. So this foramen ovale can generally be pretty minor. There are a lot of people that have this that don't even know that they have it because it is so minor. More severe cases, larger holes are going to require surgery to correct them, but it's estimated that about 20 to 25% of the population may have this condition, but have the very benign asymptomatic version where they are not going to show any symptoms and have no effects from it, and so they just never end up knowing that they have it because they're not having any symptoms of it. But it will cause a little bit of a heart murmur if it's severe enough on an echocardiogram, but usually for non-life-threatening cases, it's really better to just kind of monitor it and make sure it doesn't get worse and is not causing any issues in the patient's quality of life, because heart surgery is a pretty major surgery, and so if you don't have to do that, it's best to not do that. Over here in panel B, this issue with the aorta development, so not specifically the heart structure itself, but the aorta is a major vessel coming out of the heart. Really, really important to have that functioning optimally to get blood out to the rest of the body. This is coarctation of the aorta. This is abnormal narrowing of that vessel. And so there is a part of the fetal heart that basically ends up not kind of finishing developing correctly. So this is going to end up restricting a lot of blood flow to that systemic circulation. That is life-threatening and absolutely requires surgery in order to fix that. So more mild cases, so only slight narrowings, can be really well tolerated in patients, but most people who have this it's going to be detected very, very early on in life. So you're looking at doing heart surgery on infants, unfortunately, in that case. They can have a hard time breathing because they're not getting enough oxygen out to their body because of that narrowed blood vessel. They can have a really poor appetite. They're not really wanting to eat because, again, they're not getting enough oxygen and nutrients. They can have a hard time eating and just kind of overall failure to thrive. In older individuals, if this gets missed during infancy, this can cause dizziness and fainting, shortness of breath, as well as chest pain and other kind of generalized symptoms like fatigue and headache. But this is going to require surgery, and basically it removes that narrowed region, and then go ahead and kind of replace that to open that up and get that widened. They can also sometimes do something called an angioplasty. They're going to put a balloon in there and inflate that balloon to kind of widen that out. That doesn't always work, but that is a slightly less invasive method than just chopping that portion of the vessel out and then trying to seal those portions of the vessel back together. Down here, the ductus arteriosus is going to be this section right here between the aorta and pulmonary trunk that is supposed to close and is not closing properly. And so this isn't great. This is going to mean that high pressure blood from the aorta can actually flow into the pulmonary trunk here. So instead of that blood going out to the body, it's going to come back into the pulmonary trunk to get sent to the lungs. And so having that extra fluid in the lungs is going to increase the pressure around the lungs and actually makes it hard to breathe. And so there are some different surgical treatments for this, but this, if it's left untreated, can cause congestive heart failure. So that's really not great. And then this last condition over here, this is called tetralogy of Fallot. This is caused by something we're not sure what, potentially exposure to environmental factors, and this happens when the interventricular septum, so that muscular layer in between the ventricles, does not close the way it's supposed to, and so then we're going to get that mixing of deoxygenated and oxygenated blood, and so we are pumping blood out the aorta that is partially oxygenated, which is going to obviously mean that less oxygen gets to the cells of the body, which is not going to be good. This is extensive surgical repair. Unfortunately, this condition does have a high mortality rate, and it just kind of gets worse as people get older. So congenital heart defects are not great, but they do have some good treatment options for them these days. So we'll briefly look at the cardiac skeleton here. So that cardiac skeleton is made out of cartilage, not bone in this particular case, and is mostly made up of these valves and then some of that supporting cartilage structure that holds the valves in place, rather than them being anchored directly into that muscular layer. And so this is what those tendons look like that are going to hold open some of those valves connected to something called the papillary muscles. Those will contract to open up the valves, so they'll pull on the tendons to open the valves up. We are going to continue talking about this cardiac cycle in the next video.